Hello, residents of Wellhomed. I've got Love Comes Softly again. We're on chapter 5, so I'm calling this part 3. Remember, it was about Clark and Marty. Marty went west with her husband, and he died on the trip. So, actually, at his funeral, this man came up and said, "Listen, we can make this a marriage of convenience. I'll marry you and take care of you and give you a place to live and food to eat, and you take care of my little baby girl." And so that's what they did. She turns out that at the very beginning, of course, she's still grieving, but she's doing a lot of things that she's not done before, like cooking and taking care of a house. She's young, so we see some humorous things, we see some sad things, and we'll get back to the story with Clark and Marty, and the little girl's name is Missy. It says, by late afternoon, Marty had finished washing everything that belonged to her and some of Clark's and Missy's clothes as well. The day was much cooler than the previous one, she thought with relief. She couldn't have tolerated another one like that. This felt more like mid-October, even if it was still a glorious Indian summer day. Marty looked out toward the west. Far beyond the rolling hills, the blue mountains rose in majesty. Was it from here that Clark was seeking the help of his God? The trees along the hillside were garbed in yellows and reds. Indeed, many of the leaves were already on the ground or being carried southward by a gusty breeze. It was a beautiful scene, and how happy she would have been to share it with Clem. If only she and Clem could have had this together. Her heart ached even more than her tired back as she emptied the water from the washtubs. Missy was having a nap. Marty was glad to be free of the child for a while, almost as glad as she had been to have Clark away for the day. How relieved she had felt at his announcement that morning. Maybe with luck, the neighbor's work would keep him away for several days. She hardly dared hope for so much. She had planned to look around the farm today to learn where things were, but she felt far too tired just now. She'd just sneak a few minutes of rest while Missy was still sleeping, and then take her scouting trip a little later. She threw out the last of the rinse water, replaced the tubs on the pegs on the side of the house, and with extreme weariness went in to stretch out on her bed. She cried a bit before sleep claimed her, but the sleep that came was the most restful one that she'd had since Clem had died. Marty slept on, unconscious of the fact Missy had awakened, looked over at her as she slept, and then, with a great deal of maneuvering, climbed from her crib and went in search of her pa. Marty awoke with a start, not sure what had roused her, but already sensing that something was wrong. Maybe Missy had cried. She propped herself on one elbow and looked at the crib. No, it wasn't that. Missy wasn't even there. Missy wasn't there, but she must be. Marty sprang up, her heart pounding. Where was Missy? Maybe Clark had come home and taken the child with him. Don't panic, she told herself. She's got to be okay. Marty checked the corral, but the team was not back. She looked all around the buildings, calling as she went. No Missy. She ranged further and further from the buildings, but still no Missy. She was getting frantic now in spite of her efforts to keep herself under control. Where could Missy be? What should she do? Tears were streaming down Marty's cheeks. Her dress had suffered another tear near the hem, and she had thorns in her hands from the wild rose bushes that she had forced her way through. She checked the creek, up and down its banks, searching the clear, shallow water, but no sign of Missy or of anything that belonged to her. Maybe she followed the road, Marty thought, and she set off at a hurried pace down the dusty, rutted roadway. On and on she stumbled. Surely she couldn't have gotten this far, Marty reasoned, but she hurried on because she knew of nothing else to do. Then, over the hill in the road ahead, she saw Clark's team coming toward her. She could have stopped by the side of the road and waited for him to approach her, but she didn't even think of it. What could she say to Clark? How could she tell him? She couldn't even be trusted to care for one small child. Would Clark have some idea of where to search for her that Marty had not already tried? On she plodded until finally she had to step aside to allow the team to draw up beside her. She looked up at Clark, misery showing on her dirt and tear-streaked face. There sat Missy, as big as life, on her pa's knee, looking very proud of herself. Clark rode the horses to a stop and reached down a hand to help Marty into the wagon. She climbed up reluctantly, her head spinning. What must he think? They traveled toward home in silence. Why didn't he say something? He'd not spoken since he'd said giddy up to the team. Missy was quiet too. Well, she'd better be, that little demon. If she said one word, Marty knew she'd feel like smacking her. Her great relief at seeing her safe and sound was now replaced with a feeling of anger toward the child. Marty's face stung, both from the effort of her frantic search and her deep humiliation. Then her chin went up. So he wasn't talking. Well, neither was she. He could think what he would. She wasn't doing any explaining. She hated him anyway, and she didn't think much more of his undisciplined child. If I can just stick it out for that wagon train, then I'll be going out of this wretched place so fast you won't even find my tracks. The woman in her wanted desperately to resort to tears, but the woman in her also refused her even that small comfort. Don't you dare, she warned herself, don't you dare give him that satisfaction. She held her head high, eyes straight ahead, and remained that way until they reached the house. Contemptuously, she ignored any help that Clark might have given her and climbed down over the wheel, managing to tear her dress even further. He placed Missy on the ground, and Marty scooped the child up rather roughly and went into the house. Missy seemed unbothered by it all and paid no attention as her new mamma went noisily about starting another fire in the kitchen stove, the last one having died out. Another meal to prepare, but what? It caused her further embarrassment, but Barney knew that it would have to be pancakes again. That was about the only thing that she really knew how to make. Well, let him choke on 'em. She didn't care. Why should she? She owed him nothing. She wished that she had stayed in her wagon and starved to death. That's what she wished. Amazingly enough, Marty's fire started, and the fine cook stove was soon spilling out heat. Marty didn't even think to be grateful as she stormed about the kitchen, making coffee and preparing her batch of pancake batter. She'd fry a few pieces of ham rather than bacon, she decided. She really couldn't understand why it bothered her so much that all of her efforts since coming to this house had met with such complete failure. She shouldn't care at all, and yet she did, much as she didn't want to. Underneath, Marty felt deeply that failure was a foe to be combated and defeated. It was the way she'd grown up, and it was not easily forsaken now. While the griddle was heating, she cast an angry look at Missy. Now you stay put, she warned, then hurried out to bring in all of her washing before the night's dampness set in. When Clark came in from the barn, supper, such as it was ready. If he was surprised at pancakes again, he didn't show it. Marty burned to realize that his pancakes had been just as good as hers. So what? She stormed. My coffee be okay? It must have been, too, because when she again missed seeing Clark's empty cup and he got to refill it, he remarked, "Good coffee," as he poured her second cup. Marty's face burned again. After supper, she cleared the table and washed Missy up for bed. She still felt like shaking the little tyke each time that she touched her, but refrained from doing so. When Missy had been tucked in and Marty had washed her own hot, dusty feet, she excused herself with a murmur and, gathering her things from a chair in the sitting room, took them to her bedroom and shut the door. It would soon be necessary to light the lamp. She carefully folded her worn dresses and undergarments, laying them on her bed. If only she had a needle and some thread. But she wouldn't ask him, she determined. Never. She sat down on her bed to allow herself a more comfortable position for her self-pity. It was then that she noticed a small sewing basket in the corner behind the door. For a moment she couldn't believe her amazing find, but upon crossing to the basket she discovered more than she had dared to hope for. There was thread of various colors, needles of several sizes, a perfect pair of scissors, and even some small pieces of cloth. Determinedly, Marty settled down. Sewing. Now that was one thing that she could do. Though mending hardly fit into the same category as sewing, she felt. She was dismayed as she tried to make something decent out of the worn things before her, and the longer she worked, the more discouraged she became. She had attacked the least worn items first, but by the time she reached the last few articles, she was completely dejected. They'd never last the winter, and it was a sure thing that she'd never ask him for anything. Never. Even if she was forced to wear nothing but rags. She remembered his words as she pulled the torn dress over her head and replaced it with a mended nightie. "We never been fancy, but we try and be proper." Well, Mr. Proper, what could you do when you had nothing to make yourself proper with? Marty fell into bed, and as the events of the day crowded through her mind, the spilled coffee, the tantrum-throwing Missy, the frantic search, more pancakes, a sob arose in her throat, and again she cried herself to sleep. If Clem were only there, her world would be made right again. The next morning showed a cloudy sky as Marty looked out of the window. The weather was changing. It wouldn't be long until the beautiful Indian summer would have to give way to winter's fury. But not yet, she told herself. The day was still warm, and the sky not too overcast. Perhaps the clouds would soon move away and let the sun shine again. Slowly, she climbed from her bed. Surely, today must be an improvement on yesterday, she hoped. Already yesterday seemed a long way in the past, and the day before, the day that she had buried Clem. Marty could hardly believe that that had happened only 2 brief days ago. 2 days that had seemed forever. Marty slipped into the gingham that she had mended the night before, cast a glance in Missy's direction, and quietly moved toward the door. She did hope that the early morning scene of yesterday would not be repeated. She didn't know if she could take it again. She put on the coffee and set the dishes on the table, then started the preparations for the morning pancakes. "Dad blam it," she bit her lip. "I'm tired of pancakes myself." It hadn't seemed so bad to have pancakes over and over when that was all that was available, but with so much good food at her disposal, it seemed a shame to be eating pancakes. She'd have to figure something out, but in the meantime they needed breakfast. She went out for another piece of side bacon. Missy awoke, and without incident allowed Marty to dress her. Score 1 point for that. She placed her in the homemade chair and pulled it back from the table to keep small fingers from pulling things off. When Clark came in from the barn, the breakfast was ready, and Missy sat well behaved in her chair. "Clothed and in her right mind," Clark mused. He did not bother to say it aloud, for he feared that the context would be missed by Marty. They sat down together at the table, and after the morning reading and prayer, breakfast proceeded without anything out of the ordinary happening. Marty watched carefully, even though on the sly, for the emptying of Clark's coffee cup. But when she jumped for the pot, he waved it aside. "I'd like to, but I better not take me a second cup this morning. The sky looks more like winter every day, and Jed still has some grain out. I'm going to get on over there as quick as I can," he hesitated. "But that's good coffee." Marty poured her own second cup and put the pot back. The only thing that he could say about her was that she made good coffee. Well, maybe she was lucky that she could do that much. Clark stopped at the door and said over his shoulder, "I'll be eating my dinner with the Larsons again." Then he was gone. This time, Missy's complaining lasted only a few minutes. Marty's thoughts turned to his words. Betty's tickled pink to be able to have him one meal a day to the Larsons. Wouldn't it be a laugh should Mrs. Larson give him pancakes? In spite of herself, Marty couldn't keep a smile from flitting across her face. Then she sat down to leisurely enjoy her second cup of coffee and plan her day. First, she would completely empty and scrub out the kitchen cupboards, and then she'd go on to the rest of the kitchen, the walls, window, curtains. By night, she vowed, everything would be shining. She didn't spend as long over her coffee as she'd intended, for as she planned her day, she became anxious to begin it. She hurriedly washed up the dishes and found Missy some things that she hoped would keep her amused for a while. Then she set to work in earnest. She might lack in a lot of ways, she thought, but she could apply herself. And apply herself she did. By the time the ticking clock on the mantel told her that it was 12:30, the cupboards were all scrubbed and rearranged to suit her own fancy. She had discovered things, too, like ground corn for muffins and grains for cooked cereals. Maybe breakfast wouldn't always have to be pancakes after all. She stopped and prepared a meal for herself and Missy, consisting of fried ham and a slice of bread, with milk to drink for both of them. She was glad that milk was plentiful. Clem had fretted that she should be drinking milk for the baby on the way. Now there was milk in abundance, and Clem's boy would be strong when he arrived. After Marty tucked Missy in for her nap, she set to work again. She felt tired, but under no circumstances would she lie down and give Missy a chance to repeat her performance of yesterday. The little tyke must have walked over a mile before she met her pa. At the thought of it, Marty felt again the sting of humiliation. No, sirree, there was no way that she'd let that happen again, even if she dropped dead on her feet. On she worked, washing the curtains and placing them out in the breeze to dry. Then she tackled the window until it shone and went on to the walls with more energy than she knew she possessed. It was hard, slow work, but she was pleased with her accomplishment. As she scrubbed away at the wooden walls, she was amazed at the amount of water that it took. A number of times she had to stop and refill her pan. Remembering the curtains, she stopped her scrubbing and went in search of anything resembling an iron so that she could press the curtains before rehanging them. She found a set of sad irons in the shed's corner cupboard and placed them on the stove to heat. It was then that she realized that in her preoccupation with her scrubbing, she had let the fire go out again. So the task of rebuilding it was hers once more. She scolded herself as she fussed with the small flame to try to coax it into a blaze. When finally it began to sustain herself, she returned to her scrubbing. She refilled her pan many more times and had to take the buckets to the well for more water. Finally, the task was finished. The logs shone even if they had drank water. By the time she brought in the curtains, the irons were hot enough to press them. They looked fresh and crisp as she placed them at the window. Missy wakened, and Marty brought her from her bed and got a mug of milk for each of them. Missy seemed cheerful and chattery after her sleep, and Marty found her talkative little companion rather enjoyable. It kept her mind off other things, just as her hard work had been doing. She placed Missy in her chair with a piece of bread to nibble on and set to work on the wooden floor with hot, soapy water and scrub brush. By the time she was through, her arms and back ached, but the floor was wondrously clean. She gave the rug at the door a good shaking outside and replaced it again, then stood and surveyed the small kitchen. Everything looked and smelled clean. She was proud of herself. The kitchen window gleamed. The curtains fairly crackled with cleanliness. The walls looked sort of funny somehow. Oh, the logs looked clean and shiny, but somehow the chinking looked strange, sort of gray and muddy instead of the white it had been before. Marty crossed to the nearest wall and poked a finger at the chinking. It didn't just look muddy, it was muddy. Muddy and funny. Marty wrinkled her nose. What had she done? The water, of course. It wasn't the logs drinking the water. The chinking had slurped up the scrub water thirstily, and now it was gooey and limp. She hoped with all her heart that it would dry quickly before Clark got home. She looked at the clock. Wouldn't be long either. She better get cracking if supper was to be more than pancakes. She had noticed that the bread was as good as gone. Then what would she do? She'd never baked bread before, nor even watched her mother do it that she could remember. She hadn't the slightest idea how to start. Well, she'd make biscuits. She didn't know how to bake them either, but surely it couldn't be too hard. She washed her hands and went to the cupboard. She felt that it was more her cupboard now that she'd put everything where she wanted it. She found the flour and salt. Did you put eggs in biscuit? She wasn't sure, but she'd add a couple just in case. She added milk, stirred the mixture. Would that do it? Well, she'd give it a try. She sliced some potatoes for frying and got out some ham. She supposed that she should have some vegetables too, so she went to work on some carrots. As she peeled them, she heard old Bob welcome home the approaching team. Clark would care for the horses and then do the chores. He'd be in for supper in about 40 minutes, she guessed. So she left the carrots and went to put the biscuits in the oven. They handled easily enough, and she pictured an appreciative look in Clark's eyes as he reached for another one. She went back to her potatoes in the frying pan, stirring them carefully so that they wouldn't burn. Oh, the coffee! She suddenly cried and hurried to get the coffee pot on to boil. After all, she could make good coffee. She sliced some ham and placed it in the other frying pan, savoring the aroma as it began to cook. She smelled the biscuits and could barely refrain from opening the oven door to peek at them. She was sure they'd need a few minutes more. She stirred the potatoes again and looked anxiously at the muddy chinking between the logs. It wasn't drying very fast. Well, she just wouldn't mention it. Maybe Clark wouldn't notice it. By morning, it would be its old white self again. The ham needed turning and the potatoes were done. She pulled them toward the back of the stove and put more wood in the firebox. Then she remembered the carrots. Oh dear, they were still in the peeling pan, only half ready. Hurriedly, she went to work on them, taking a small nick out of a finger in her haste. Finally, she had the pot of carrots on the stove, placing them on what she hoped was the hottest spot to hurry them up. The potatoes were certainly done, rather mushy looking from being overcooked and overstirred, and now they sat near the back of the stove, looking worse every minute. Oh, the biscuits! Marty grabbed fiercely at the oven door, fearing that the added minutes may have ruined her efforts. But the minutes hadn't ruined them at all. Nothing could have done any harm to those hard-looking lumps that sat stubbornly on the pan, looking like so many rocks. Marty pulled them out and dumped one on the cupboard to cool slightly before she made the grim test. She slowly closed her teeth upon it to no avail. The biscuit refused to give. She clamped down harder. Still no give. "Dad, burn!" murmured Marty, and opening the stove, she threw the offensive thing in. The flames around it hissed slightly like a cat with its back up, but the hard lump refused to disappear. It just sat and blackened as the flame licked around it. "That blamed thing, it won't even burn," she stormed, and crammed a stick of wood on top of it to cover up the telltale lump. Now, now what do I do with these? Marty looked around. How could she get rid of the lumpy things? She couldn't burn them. She couldn't throw them out to the dog to be exposed to all eyes. She'd bury them, the rotten things. She hurriedly scooped them into her skirt and started for the door. "Missy, you stay put," she called. Then, remembering her previous experience, she turned and pulled the coffee pot to the back of the stove. Out the door she went, first looking toward the barn to make sure that her path was clear. Then quickly she ran to the far end of the garden. The soil was still soft, and she fell on her knees and hurriedly dug a hole with her hands and dumped in those disgusting lumps. She covered them quickly and sprinted back to the house. When she reached the yard, she could smell burning ham. "Oh no," she cried, "what a mess!" She washed her hands quickly at the outside basin, and the tears washed her cheeks as she raced for the tiny kitchen where everything seemed to be going wrong. When Clark came in for supper, he was served lukewarm, mushy potatoes, slightly burned slices of ham, along with the few slices of bread that remained. There was no mention of the carrots, which had just begun to boil, and of course no mention of the sad lumps called biscuits. Clark said nothing as he ate, nothing, that is, except, "That's right, good coffee." And we'll stop there. And the experiences of a brand new housewife. She's having a hard time, isn't she? Well, we'll find out in a few days if her cooking gets any better. All right. See you all later.